Case 1, Chanel Lewis. A quiet August evening in 2016 would shatter one family forever and expose a stranger danger that haunts every parent's nightmare. Karina Vetrano, a vibrant 30-year-old speech pathologist, laced up her running shoes and headed toward the Spring Creek Park trails near Howard Beach, Queens. Her father, a retired firefighter, usually joined her on these runs, but a back injury kept him home that day. When Karina didn't return by nightfall, panic set in her phone went straight to voicemail. Her car sat untouched in the driveway. Something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. By dawn, hundreds of volunteers combed through the marshlands surrounding the jogging path. Police helicopters circled overhead while search dogs tracked scents through dense vegetation. Phil Vetrano, Karina's father, joined the search despite his injury, driven by a dread no parent should ever know. Hours into the operation, searchers discovered Karina's body concealed in tall weeds, roughly 15 feet from the trail. She had been attacked with brutal force. Her running clothes were torn, scratches covered her body. The medical examiner would later determine she fought desperately for her life before succumbing to strangulation. Investigators immediately began processing what would become one of the most crucial crime scenes in recent Queens history. Beneath Karina's fingernails, forensic technicians recovered DNA evidence. On her cell phone, they found the route she'd planned to run. Surveillance cameras from nearby businesses captured grainy footage of the area, but no clear suspect emerged. The attack appeared random, which made it infinitely more terrifying. If Karina Vetrano could be targeted on a familiar trail in broad daylight, no jogger in New York felt safe. Months passed with agonizing slowness. The NYPD conducted over 300 interviews. They collected DNA samples from potential suspects throughout the borough. Then, in February 2017, 6 months after the attack, investigators received information about a local resident named Chanel Lewis. The 20-year-old had been stopped by officers in April 2016 for unrelated suspicious activity near the same park. During that earlier encounter, Lewis had displayed erratic behavior and made statements that officers found concerning enough to document in a field report. Detectives located Lewis and requested a voluntary DNA sample. He agreed. When forensic analysts compared his genetic profile to the evidence recovered from beneath Karina's fingernails, they found a match. The odds of the DNA belonging to someone other than Lewis were astronomical. 1 in several trillion. Armed with this evidence, investigators brought Lewis in for questioning. Over the course of multiple interrogations, he made statements that prosecutors would later argue amounted to a confession, though defense attorneys challenged both the voluntariness and clarity of those admissions. The case against Chanel Lewis rested heavily on scientific evidence and those contested statements. Prosecutors painted a picture of a troubled young man who encountered Karina by chance and acted on violent impulses. They presented forensic experts who testified about the DNA match with certainty. They introduced Lewis's own words, captured on video during police interviews, where he appeared to acknowledge being in the park and having contact with the victim. Lewis's defense team mounted an aggressive counterattack. They argued the interrogation tactics were coercive, suggesting investigators manipulated a vulnerable defendant with cognitive limitations. They questioned the collection procedures for the DNA evidence. They emphasized the absence of any prior connection between Lewis and Vetrano, any history of violence, or any clear motive. How could this random encounter, they asked, lead to such a brutal outcome without warning signs? The first trial in 2018 ended in a hung jury, with deliberations stretching across days as jurors struggled to reach unanimity. The prosecution immediately announced they would retry the case. In the second trial, held in early 2019, prosecutors sharpened their presentation. They walked jurors through the DNA evidence, step by methodical step. They replayed interrogation footage with enhanced audio. They brought in additional forensic specialists who addressed every defense challenge with clinical precision. This time, the jury convicted Chanel Lewis of all charges. He was found guilty of taking Karina Vetrano's life during an attack that shocked the conscience of New York City. In April 2019, a judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Phil Vetrano sat in the courtroom as the sentence was read, finally hearing the words that marked the end of a 3-year journey through grief and legal proceedings. Outside the courthouse, he told reporters that while nothing would bring Karina back, knowing her attacker would never walk free brought a measure of peace. The Vetrano case sparked widespread conversations about safety in public parks and the randomness of violent crime. It demonstrated how DNA technology can crack cases even when no obvious suspect exists. It also raised ongoing debates about interrogation techniques and the vulnerability of certain defendants in police custody. Chanel Lewis remains incarcerated, his appeals challenging both the interrogation process and aspects of the forensic evidence. But for the Vetrano family and the Howard Beach community, the conviction marked the closing of a chapter written in unimaginable pain. And while one family found answers in Queens, another case was unfolding in Brooklyn that would prove truth is sometimes stranger than the darkest fiction. Case 2. John Giuca. The party seemed like harmless fun, the kind of impromptu gathering that defines college life in New York City. Mark Fisher, a 19-year-old Fairfield University student visiting friends in Brooklyn, arrived at a house party on Argyle Road in October 2003. The neighborhood, a quiet residential enclave, suddenly pulsed with music and young people celebrating the weekend. Fisher, described by friends as outgoing and athletic, blended easily into the crowd. He had no reason to suspect that stepping into that party would be the last decision he'd ever make. When dawn broke on October 19th, a resident walking their dog discovered Fisher's body on a nearby lawn. He had been shot multiple times at close range. His wallet was missing. His jacket lay several feet away. The scene suggested both violence and haste, a crime that escalated quickly and ended fatally. Detectives from the NYPD's Homicide Division immediately canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual during the night. The investigation led straight back to the Argyle Road party, and specifically to John Giuca, a 20-year-old local resident who hosted frequent gatherings at his mother's house. Witnesses placed Fisher at the party earlier that evening, mingling with Giuca's social circle. Some partygoers reported seeing tension between Fisher and certain guests, while others described Giuca as someone who cultivated a tough reputation. In the neighborhood, prosecutors would later argue that Fisher somehow became entangled in conflicts surrounding Giuca's standing among his peers, though the exact trigger remained murky. As detectives dug deeper, they focused on Giuca and his close friend Antonio Russo. Multiple witnesses came forward describing conversations where the two young men discussed what happened after the party. Some claimed Giuca made incriminating statements. Others described Russo as the actual shooter, with Giuca playing an orchestrating role. The testimonies painted a picture of a crime born from misplaced machismo and a catastrophic loss of judgment. The case against John Giuca hinged largely on witness accounts, each one adding layers to the prosecution's narrative. There was no physical evidence directly tying him to the shooting. No gun was ever recovered. But prosecutors argued that Giuca facilitated or encouraged the attack, making him equally culpable under New York's felony murder statute. They presented witnesses who testified about Giuca's reputation for violence and his desire to be seen as someone not to be crossed. They suggested Fisher, an outsider who didn't understand the neighborhood dynamics, inadvertently challenged that reputation. Giuca's defense attorneys countered that the witnesses were unreliable, some with criminal histories of their own, others possibly seeking deals with prosecutors. They argued the evidence was circumstantial at best, and that Giuca was being scapegoated because of his lifestyle and associations, rather than any proven involvement in Fisher's death. They pointed out inconsistencies in witness statements and questioned why investigators focused so heavily on their client when other partygoers remained viable suspects. The trial became one of the most heavily covered criminal proceedings in Brooklyn during the mid-2000s. Cameras crowded the courthouse steps. Daily, Fisher's family attended every session, desperate for justice. Giuca's mother, Doreen Giuliano, became a fixture in the courtroom as well, visibly devastated by the charges against her son. The media presented the case as a clash between suburban innocence and urban street culture, though those familiar with the complexities warned against such simplistic narratives. In 2005, after weeks of testimony, the jury convicted John Giuca of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Antonio Russo was tried separately and also convicted. For the Fisher family, the verdicts brought a bittersweet closure. Their son was gone, but his killers would face consequences. Yet as Giuca began serving his sentence, his family refused to accept the outcome as final. Doreen Giuliano launched an extraordinary campaign to prove her son's innocence. She learned investigative techniques. She tracked down witnesses. In a twist that would later generate its own headlines, she even went undercover in the neighborhood, befriending one of the trial's key witnesses and recording conversations, where he allegedly admitted to lying on the stand. These recordings became central to Giuca's appeals and would eventually shake the foundations of his conviction. In February 2018, after more than a decade behind bars, Giuca's conviction was overturned by an appellate court. A panel of 4 judges ruled unanimously that his trial attorney had provided ineffective counsel by failing to present a proper defense. The decision sent shockwaves through New York's legal community and gave the Fisher family a devastating blow. The possibility that their son's killer might go free for Giuca's supporters, it represented vindication. For prosecutors, it was an injustice that demanded correction. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office immediately appealed the appellate court's decision to New York's highest court, the Court of Appeals. They argued that despite the defense attorney's shortcomings, the evidence against Giuca remained overwhelming. The case presented fundamental questions about how much weight should be given to ineffective counsel claims. When the underlying evidence of guilt appeared strong, legal experts on both sides watched closely as the state's highest court prepared to weigh in. In June 2019, the New York Court of Appeals delivered its ruling. In a decision that reversed the appellate court's findings, the state's highest judges reinstated Giuca's original 2005 conviction. The court determined that while his trial attorney's performance may have been flawed, the evidence presented at trial was sufficient to support the guilty verdict. The decision meant Giuca would return to prison to continue serving his 25 years to life sentence without the possibility of a new trial. The ruling devastated Giuca and his family. Doreen Giuliano, who had spent years fighting for her son's freedom, vowed to continue seeking justice through whatever legal means remained available for the Fisher family. The Court of Appeals decision brought relief that the conviction would stand, though it could never ease the pain of losing Mark. The legal battle had reopened old wounds and forced them to relive the tragedy repeatedly through years of court proceedings. The Giuca case remains deeply controversial, with supporters insisting he was wrongly convicted and critics arguing justice was appropriately served. It highlighted questions about witness reliability, the effectiveness of legal representation, and a mother's unwavering determination to save her son. The case also exposed tensions in New York's appellate system, where different levels of courts reached opposite conclusions About the same evidence, Mark Fisher's family continues to mourn their loss while defending the conviction. And as that Brooklyn courtroom drama finally wound down, detectives in upstate New York were still searching for answers in a case where the victim's body was never found. Case 3, Calvin Harris. September the 11th, 2001, will forever be remembered as the day terror struck America, but in the small upstate community of Spencer, New York, that same date marks a different tragedy. While the nation watched the Twin Towers fall, Michelle Harris vanished from her home in Tioga County. She was a mother of 4, estranged from her husband Calvin Harris, navigating the painful final stages of a contested divorce. When she failed to pick up her children from school the next morning, friends knew immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. Michelle was devoted to her kids. She would never simply disappear. Calvin Harris became the focus of suspicion almost instantly. The couple's marriage had deteriorated over several years, marked by arguments over finances, custody, and property court documents revealed bitter disputes about their jointly owned businesses and the future of the family farm. Friends described Michelle as fearful in the weeks before she vanished, confiding that she worried about what Calvin might do as the divorce proceedings intensified. She had even discussed her concerns with an attorney, asking what protections were available. On the night of September 11th, Calvin claimed he was home alone, watching coverage of the terrorist attacks on television. But investigators discovered inconsistencies in his timeline. Neighbors reported seeing unusual activity at the Harris property around the hours Michelle likely disappeared. Her car was found parked near the house, keys still inside. Her purse remained at the residence. Most troubling, traces of what appeared to be blood were detected in locations that suggested a cleanup effort, though testing proved inconclusive about whose blood it might be. Despite extensive searches involving volunteer groups, cadaver dogs, and ground-penetrating radar, Michelle's body was never located. The sprawling farmland and surrounding forests offered countless places to conceal remains. Investigators theorized that Calvin, intimately familiar with the terrain, hid Michelle somewhere she would never be found. Without a body, however, building a prosecutable case proved extraordinarily challenging. In 2006, 5 years after Michelle's disappearance, prosecutors finally brought charges against Calvin Harris. They argued that circumstantial evidence painted a clear picture: a man with motive, opportunity, and a pattern of controlling behavior who killed his estranged wife to avoid a costly divorce settlement. The trial presented jurors with conflicting expert testimony about the blood evidence, witness accounts of the couple's volatile relationship, and Calvin's own contradictory statements to police. The jury convicted him, and Calvin Harris was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. But appellate courts later overturned the conviction, ruling that certain evidence should not have been admitted. Prosecutors tried him again in 2009. Once more, he was convicted. Once more, appellate courts reversed the verdict due to legal errors during the proceedings. The Harris case was becoming a study in judicial frustration, where the system kept reaching the same conclusion, only to have it undone by technicalities. A third trial in 2014 ended in a mistrial when jurors could not reach a unanimous verdict. The evidence remained entirely circumstantial. Without Michelle's body, without a weapon, without eyewitnesses, some jurors simply could not bring themselves to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors, however, refused to give up. They believed justice for Michelle demanded persistence. In 2016, Calvin Harris faced his 4th trial. By this point, the case had consumed 15 years and generated thousands of pages of legal documents. Prosecutors refined their presentation, emphasizing the totality of circumstances rather than any single piece of evidence. They walked jurors through Calvin's financial motives, the domestic tensions, the suspicious timeline, and the blood traces that, while not definitive, supported their theory. defense attorneys countered that the state was trying to convict a man based on suspicion rather than proof. That Michelle could have disappeared for reasons unrelated to Calvin, and that repeated trials violated principles of fairness. This time, the jury acquitted Calvin Harris. After 4 trials, 2 convictions, 2 reversals, 1 mistrial, and a final not guilty verdict, he walked free for Michelle's family. The outcome was devastating. They remain convinced that Calvin killed Michelle and that the legal system failed to deliver justice. They continue to hold memorial services for Michelle, keeping her memory alive and hoping that someday, somehow, her remains will be found and provide the definitive proof that eluded prosecutors. Calvin Harris has maintained his innocence throughout, insisting he had nothing to do with Michelle's disappearance. He suggests that she may have fled voluntarily or met with foul play at someone else's hands. The case remains technically open, though with no new leads emerging in years, closure seems increasingly unlikely. Michelle's children grew up without their mother, caught in the crossfire of legal battles and unanswered questions. The Harris case stands as one of New York's most legally complex and emotionally wrenching investigations. It demonstrates the immense challenges prosecutors face in no-body cases, where circumstantial evidence must bear the entire weight of proof. It also highlights how the appellate process, designed to protect the innocent, can sometimes frustrate families seeking justice. And while upstate New York grappled with Michelle Harris's unsolved disappearance, down in New York City, federal investigators were about to make an arrest that would ignite a national debate about where fantasy ends and criminal conspiracy begins. Case 4. Gilberto Valle. The arrest shook the NYPD to its core. One of their own, a uniformed patrol officer named Gilberto Valle, stood accused of plotting to kidnap, torture, and commit unspeakable acts against women. But here's where the case took an unprecedented turn. No crime had actually been committed. No victim had been harmed. The evidence existed entirely in the digital realm, in online chat rooms, and private messages where Valle discussed disturbing fantasies in graphic detail. The question that would captivate the nation was simple yet profound. Can you be convicted for thoughts alone? Gilberto Valle worked as an NYPD officer assigned to a Manhattan precinct. By all outward appearances, he led an ordinary life. He was married with a young child. Colleagues described him as quiet and unremarkable. But behind closed doors, Valle participated in online communities where members shared dark fantasies involving women. In these chat rooms, he discussed plans to abduct specific individuals, including women he knew personally. He researched their daily routines. He looked up their addresses using law enforcement databases. He exchanged messages with other users about methods of restraint and harm. In 2012, Valle's wife discovered his online activities while checking the family computer. Horrified by what she found, she contacted the FBI immediately. Federal agents began monitoring Valle's communications, cataloging months of disturbing conversations. They found that he had created detailed documents describing potential targets. He had searched for information about chloroform and human anatomy. In chat logs, he discussed meeting with other users to carry out these plans, even negotiating prices for victims as if they were commodities. When agents arrested Valle in October 2012, the case exploded across headlines. The media dubbed him the Cannibal Cop, a nickname that stuck despite its sensationalistic overtones. News outlets published excerpts from his chats, and public reaction ranged from horror to fascination. How could a police officer, someone entrusted to protect the public, harbor such dark fantasies? And more urgently, had he been on the verge of acting on them? Prosecutors argued that Valle crossed the line from fantasy to conspiracy. They pointed to his use of police databases to gather information about potential victims, which they said demonstrated intent and preparation. They highlighted conversations where Valle appeared to arrange meetings with other users. They presented expert testimony, suggesting that his online behavior represented a progression toward real-world action, not mere imagination. Valle's defense team mounted a case that would test the boundaries of the First Amendment and criminal law. They argued that Valle engaged in role-playing, a form of expression that, however disturbing, remained protected speech. They noted that no actual victim ever came to harm. No kidnapping took place. No meetings occurred. The women Valle discussed online lived their lives completely unaware of his fantasies. His attorneys contended that prosecuting someone for thoughts, no matter how repugnant, set a dangerous precedent that threatened fundamental freedoms. The trial became a lightning rod for debates about privacy, free speech, and the government's role in policing thought versus action. Civil liberties organizations filed briefs warning that a conviction could criminalize fantasy itself. Prosecutors countered that Valle's position as a police officer and his misuse of law enforcement resources demonstrated he was doing more than fantasizing. He was preparing. In 2013, a jury convicted Gilberto Valle of conspiracy to kidnap. The verdict suggested that jurors believed Valle had moved beyond mere fantasy into the realm of actionable planning. He faced a potential life sentence, but the story didn't end there. Judge Paul Gardef, who presided over the trial, reviewed the evidence with extraordinary care. In 2014, he issued a ruling that stunned legal observers. He overturned Valle's conviction. In a detailed opinion, Gardef concluded that while Valle's online activities were deeply disturbing, they did not constitute a genuine conspiracy. The judge found that Valle's conversations remained in the realm of fantasy, and that the government failed to prove he took concrete steps toward actually committing a crime. The so-called planning, Gardef wrote, never matured beyond dark imagination. The ruling freed Gilberto Valle, though his life was irrevocably altered. He lost his job with the NYPD. His marriage ended. He became a pariah, forever associated with the Cannibal Cop moniker. Valle later gave interviews, insisting he never intended to harm anyone. That his participation in these online communities was a shameful but victimless exploration of taboo fantasies. Critics remained unconvinced, arguing that even if he hadn't acted yet, he posed a danger. The Valle case left lasting questions about where society draws the line between disturbing thoughts and criminal acts. It highlighted the challenges law enforcement faces in the digital age, where online behaviors can suggest intent, but proving that intent reaches the threshold for prosecution remains maddeningly difficult. And it forced uncomfortable conversations about the nature of fantasy, the purpose of criminal law, and whether the system should intervene before a crime occurs. Gilberto Valle's case became a touchstone for discussions about predictive policing and thought crime. Legal scholars continue to debate Judge Gardef's decision, with some praising it as a defense of civil liberties, and others warning it may have freed a man who posed genuine danger. For Valle himself, the acquittal meant freedom but not redemption. His name remains synonymous with one of the most controversial cases in recent New York legal history. And while Valle's disturbing fantasies never materialized into real harm, another figure in New York's nightlife scene would cross that line in a crime that exposed the dark underbelly of fame and excess. Case 5. Michael Alig. Before the crime that would define him, Michael Alig was a star in a world most people never see. He ruled Manhattan's underground club scene in the early 90s, hosting parties that became legendary for their excess and creativity. The Club Kids, as his followers were known, represented a counterculture movement that celebrated flamboyance, art, and absolute freedom from convention. Alig himself became the face of this movement, featured in magazines and documentaries as the Pied Piper of New York nightlife. But underneath the glitter and spectacle, darker currents were swirling. Angel Melendez was part of that same scene, a club kid known for his fashion sense and his involvement in the drug trade that fueled late-night Manhattan. In early 1996, Melendez and Alig clashed over money, specifically over drugs that Melendez supplied. Their relationship, once friendly, deteriorated into resentment and threats. On March 17, 1996, that conflict reached a horrifying conclusion inside Alig's Riverbank West apartment. The details that later emerged were difficult to comprehend. According to statements Alig would make to authorities, an argument between him and Melendez escalated into violence. Alig's roommate, Robert Freeze Riggs, became involved. The confrontation ended with Melendez losing his life in circumstances that Alig initially tried to dismiss as accidental. But what happened next revealed a chilling capacity for concealment. Rather than contact authorities, Alig and Riggs spent days trying to cover up what occurred. They went to extraordinary lengths to dispose of evidence, behavior that suggested full awareness of the gravity of their actions. For weeks, Melendez's disappearance circulated through the club kid community as rumor and speculation. Some believed he had simply left town. Others suspected something sinister. Alig himself contributed to the uncertainty by making cryptic comments that people initially dismissed as dark humor or attention-seeking. The club kid scene thrived on theatricality, so when Alig joked about what happened, many assumed it was performance art rather than confession. But investigators from the NYPD were taking the rumors seriously. As they dug into Melendez's last known activities, evidence pointed directly to Alig's apartment. When confronted, Alig's carefully constructed facade crumbled. He eventually provided details about the fatal confrontation and what happened afterward. The investigation revealed a crime scene that had been extensively cleaned and a disposal effort that authorities characterized as calculated and deliberate. In 1997, Alig was arrested and charged with manslaughter. The case captivated New York media, not just because of the crime itself, but because it represented the spectacular fall of someone who had embodied a particular moment in the city's cultural history. The trial exposed the drug-fueled chaos of the club kid world, the toxic relationships that festered beneath the party atmosphere, and the way fame and excess can corrupt judgment entirely. Facing overwhelming evidence, Alig accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison for manslaughter. The outcome marked the end of an era for Manhattan nightlife. The club kids scattered, the parties ended. The movement Alig had built collapsed under the weight of his crime. During his incarceration, Alig gave numerous interviews and participated in documentaries about the club kid phenomenon. Some viewed this as an attempt at redemption or self-reflection. Others saw it as continued attention-seeking from someone who never truly grasped the harm he caused. Melendez's family remained largely absent from these media narratives, their grief overshadowed by the spectacle surrounding Alig. In 2014, after serving 17 years, Michael Alig was released on parole. He attempted to rebuild some version of a public life, hosting small events and maintaining a social media presence. But his past was inescapable. He remained a controversial figure, embraced by some as a cultural icon who paid his debt to society, and reviled by others as someone who took a life and turned even that into performance. On Christmas Day, 2020, Michael Alig was found deceased in his Manhattan apartment. The medical examiner determined he died from an overdose of multiple substances. He was 54 years old. His death closed the final chapter on one of New York's most infamous nightlife stories, a tale of ambition, creativity, excess, and ultimately, tragedy. The club kid era he defined had already passed into history, remembered as both a peak of artistic expression and a cautionary tale about the cost of living without boundaries. Alig's case serves as a stark reminder that fame, even in subcultures, doesn't exempt anyone from consequences. It also illustrates how a crime can overshadow every achievement, reducing a complex life to a single terrible act. And while Michael Alig's story unfolded in Manhattan's glittering nightlife, another crime in the Hamptons would reveal how wealth and jealousy can turn just as deadly. Case 6. Daniel Pelosi. The mansions of East Hampton have always represented the pinnacle of American wealth, summer retreats where the elite escape the pressures of city life. But in October 2001, one of those sprawling estates became the scene of a brutal crime that would expose the dark side of money, marriage, and betrayal. Ted Ammon was a successful investment banker who had built a fortune on Wall Street. His beachfront home symbolized that success. On the morning of October 22nd, when his business associate arrived for a scheduled meeting and found him unresponsive, the discovery set in motion an investigation that would transfix the Hamptons community for years. Ammon had died from severe head trauma, the result of multiple blows that investigators determined were delivered with lethal force. The crime scene suggested rage rather than robbery. Nothing of significant value was missing. The attack appeared personal, driven by emotion rather than financial gain. Detectives immediately began examining Ammon's life for potential suspects, and one name surfaced repeatedly: Daniel Pelosi. Pelosi was an electrician who had been performing work on various properties in the Hamptons. He had met Ammon's estranged wife, Generosa, during a renovation project, and the two had begun a relationship while her divorce from Ammon was still being finalized. The divorce itself was contentious, with substantial assets at stake and bitter disputes over custody of the couple's adopted children. Friends of Ted Ammon described him as concerned about Generosa's new relationship and worried about the influence Pelosi might have on the situation. On the night of Ammon's death, investigators discovered that Pelosi had been in the area. Security systems and witness statements placed him near the East Hampton property, around the time the attack likely occurred. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered evidence suggesting Pelosi had entered the home that evening. His fingerprints were found in locations that contradicted his claims of never being inside. Phone records showed communications between Pelosi and Generosa that raised questions about their knowledge of Ammon's plans and whereabouts. The case against Daniel Pelosi built slowly. Prosecutors developed a theory that he killed Ammon to secure Generosa's inheritance and ensure their relationship could continue without the complications of the ongoing divorce. They argued that Pelosi saw Ammon as an obstacle to the life he wanted, and that he acted on that resentment with calculated violence. Forensic evidence, including blood patterns and the nature of Ammon's injuries, suggested the attack was ferocious and sustained. Pelosi maintained his innocence, but his behavior following Ammon's death raised eyebrows. He and Generosa married shortly after, and they quickly began spending the inheritance Generosa received from Ammon's estate. The couple purchased luxury vehicles, traveled extensively, and lived lavishly. To prosecutors and investigators, this suggested not grief or caution, but rather relief that Ammon was no longer in the picture. Generosa's own health was declining during this period. She had been diagnosed with cancer, and her condition deteriorated rapidly. Before her death in 2003, she made decisions about her estate that effectively cut her children out of significant inheritance, leaving much of her wealth to Pelosi. This development added another layer of tragedy to the case and intensified scrutiny of Pelosi's relationship with her. In 2004, prosecutors finally brought charges against Daniel Pelosi. The trial became a media sensation, with daily coverage of the proceedings and intense public interest in the intersection of wealth, infidelity, and violence. Witnesses testified about Pelosi's jealousy toward Ammon and his discussions about the inheritance. forensic experts walked jurors through the evidence linking Pelosi to the crime scene. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man motivated by greed and willing to commit the ultimate crime to secure financial comfort. Pelosi's defense attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that prosecutors were building their case on assumptions rather than proof. They suggested that investigators had focused on Pelosi because of his relationship with Generosa, rather than following all possible leads. They questioned the reliability of forensic evidence and pointed out gaps in the timeline that prosecutors presented. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution. Daniel Pelosi was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Ted Ammon's family expressed relief that justice had been served, though they acknowledged that no verdict could bring him back or undo the damage to his children, who had lost both parents in devastating circumstances. The Pelosi case became emblematic of Hampton's noir, a genre of crime that exposes how privilege and wealth don't prevent tragedy, but sometimes create the conditions for it. The trial revealed the fractures in what had appeared to be an ideal life, the way financial disputes can escalate into violence, and how relationships formed in the wreckage of marriages can turn toxic. Daniel Pelosi remains incarcerated, continuing to maintain his innocence through appeals and public statements. The case periodically resurfaces in documentaries and true crime retrospectives, each retelling examining the evidence and the motivations from different angles. For the Hamptons community, the Ammon killing serves as a reminder that even in the most exclusive enclaves, darkness can intrude. And while wealth may insulate people from many of life's hardships, it offers no protection against human jealousy and violence. From the mansions of East Hampton, we turn now to the streets of Brooklyn, where a series of targeted attacks would terrorize local shopkeepers and expose the desperation of a man whose life had spiraled into financial ruin. Case 7. Salvatore Perrone. The small businesses that line Brooklyn's streets are more than just stores. They're community anchors, gathering places where neighbors know each other by name. In the summer of 2012, 3 such establishments became crime scenes in what appeared to be a calculated series of attacks. The victims were shopkeepers, hard-working individuals who kept their doors open to serve their neighborhoods. Within weeks, all 3 had lost their lives under circumstances that suggested a methodical pattern, rather than random violence. The first incident occurred in July, when the proprietor of a clothing store in Bay Ridge was found deceased inside his shop. The scene indicated a confrontation that escalated rapidly. Nothing of significant value appeared to be missing, which puzzled investigators initially. Then, in August, a second shopkeeper was discovered in similar circumstances at a store in the same general area. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. A third attack in November confirmed what detectives feared. Someone was specifically targeting small business owners in Brooklyn. The NYPD launched an intensive investigation combining traditional detective work with modern surveillance analysis. Detectives reviewed security camera footage from the affected stores and surrounding businesses. They interviewed hundreds of people who knew the victims or frequented the shops. They analyzed the timing of the incidents and the similarities in the method of attack. What emerged was a profile of someone who visited these stores under seemingly legitimate pretenses before carrying out violence. Surveillance footage proved crucial. Multiple cameras had captured images of the same individual visiting stores in the days before the attacks. The figure wore distinctive clothing and carried a bag that appeared to contain merchandise. Witnesses reported that a man matching this description had approached various shopkeepers, claiming to sell items like clothing or accessories. Some shop owners had made purchases. Others had declined. The pattern suggested someone moving through Brooklyn's commercial districts using these sales pitches as a way to gain access to businesses and assess potential targets. Ballistics evidence linked the three incidents. The same firearm had been used in each attack, definitively connecting the crimes. This discovery intensified the manhunt, as investigators realized they were pursuing someone who had killed multiple times and could strike again. Community members, particularly small business owners, were on edge. Many began locking their doors during business hours or installing additional security measures. The breakthrough came when investigators identified Salvatore Perrone as a person of interest. Perrone was a struggling businessman who had experienced significant financial difficulties. His own ventures had failed, leaving him desperate and resentful. Detectives learned that he had been attempting to sell merchandise to various shops around Brooklyn, matching the pattern observed in surveillance footage. When they compared images from security cameras to photographs of Perrone, the resemblance was striking. A search warrant executed at Perrone's residence yielded damning evidence. Police recovered clothing that matched what the suspect wore in surveillance videos. More critically, they found a firearm that ballistics testing confirmed was used in all three killings. Forensic analysis of Perrone's belongings connected him to the crime scenes in multiple ways. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors developed a theory about Perrone's motivation. They argued that his financial failures had bred resentment toward successful business owners. His attempts to sell merchandise to these shopkeepers may have led to rejections or interactions that he perceived as disrespectful. The attacks, they suggested, were acts of rage against people who represented what he had lost. Defense attorneys would later challenge this narrative, but the forensic evidence made denying Perrone's involvement nearly impossible. The trial in 2016 presented jurors with a clear evidentiary trail. Surveillance footage showed Perrone visiting the stores. Ballistics connected the weapon found in his possession to all three crimes. Forensic specialists testified about clothing fibers and other trace evidence. Witnesses described Perrone's attempts to sell merchandise in the days before the attacks. The defense struggled to offer an alternative explanation that accounted for the totality of evidence. Salvatore Perrone was convicted on multiple counts of murder and weapons possession. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again threaten Brooklyn's business community. The verdicts brought a measure of closure to the victims' families and to the neighborhood shopkeepers who had lived in fear during the months when the attacks were occurring. The Perrone case highlighted the vulnerability of small business owners who work alone in their stores, often trusting that opening their doors to customers won't expose them to danger. It also demonstrated how financial desperation can twist into violence when combined with resentment and opportunity. For investigators, the case showcased the power of surveillance technology and coordinated detective work in solving serial crimes. Salvatore Perrone remains in custody, his appeals exhausted. The stores where the attacks occurred have changed hands, but the memories persist in the Brooklyn community. The case serves as a reminder that violence can erupt in the most ordinary settings, and that those who serve their neighborhoods with dedication deserve protection and justice. And while Brooklyn mourned its lost shopkeepers, in Manhattan, a former dancer's dreams of stardom would end in tragedy that exposed the dangerous intersection of romance and obsession. Case 8, Robert Chambers. The morning of August the 26th, 1986, started like any other in Central Park, until a cyclist noticed something disturbing behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art. What appeared to be someone sleeping under a tree turned out to be the body of 18-year-old Jennifer Levin. Her death would expose the dark underbelly of Manhattan's privileged youth and spark one of the most controversial trials in New York history. The case became known as the Preppy murder, and the defendant's shocking defense strategy would divide the city and ignite fierce debates about wealth, justice, and accountability. Jennifer Levin grew up on Manhattan's Upper East Side, the daughter of a successful real estate developer and a prominent child psychologist. She attended the elite Baldwin School and was known for her intelligence, beauty, and outgoing personality. Friends described her as vibrant and ambitious, someone who lit up every room she entered. On the night of August 25th, Jennifer went to Dorian's Red Hand, a popular bar on 2nd Avenue, frequented by wealthy prep school students and young professionals. It was a place where Manhattan's elite youth gathered, a world of privilege that seemed insulated from the harsh realities of urban crime. That same evening, 20-year-old Robert Chambers arrived at the same bar. Chambers came from a complicated background that masked itself behind a veneer of Upper East Side respectability. His mother worked multiple jobs to afford tuition at exclusive schools, where Chambers never quite fit in despite his good looks and charm. He had been expelled from several prep schools for disciplinary issues and theft. By 1986, he was enrolled at Boston University, but had already accumulated a troubling record of petty crimes and substance abuse. Yet in the social circles of Manhattan's young elite, Chambers maintained his image as a handsome, well-bred young man. Witnesses at Dorian's Red Hand saw Jennifer and Robert talking and flirting throughout the evening. Around 4:30 in the morning, surveillance cameras captured them leaving the bar together. They walked to Central Park, entering near the museum. What happened next would only be known through Chambers' own conflicting accounts. Hours later, when a cyclist discovered Jennifer's body, investigators found her lying behind the museum with injuries that indicated a violent struggle. Her clothing was disheveled. Marks on her neck suggested strangulation. The medical examiner would later determine she died from compression of the neck and chest. Detectives canvassed the area and quickly learned about Jennifer's evening at Dorian's Red Hand. Multiple witnesses identified Robert Chambers as the last person seen with her when investigators located Chambers at his apartment later that day. They noticed fresh scratches on his face and chest. His hands bore marks consistent with a physical altercation. During questioning, Chambers initially denied being in the park with Jennifer. As evidence mounted, he changed his story multiple times before finally admitting they had been together. The account Chambers eventually provided shocked investigators and would later become the centerpiece of his defense strategy. He claimed that Jennifer had initiated intimate contact in the park and became aggressive when he tried to resist her advances. According to Chambers, she accidentally died during what he called rough activity that got out of control. He insisted her death was accidental, not intentional. Prosecutors viewed this explanation with deep skepticism. The injuries Jennifer sustained told a different story, one of a violent confrontation where someone fought desperately for their life. The case exploded across New York media. Tabloids dubbed it the Preppy murder, and the trial became a spectacle that exposed uncomfortable truths about privilege and accountability. Chambers' defense team pursued a controversial strategy that many found deeply offensive. They attempted to paint Jennifer as sexually aggressive, suggesting she bore responsibility for her own death. This approach, which essentially put the victim on trial, generated fierce backlash. Women's advocacy groups protested outside the courthouse. The media coverage became increasingly polarized. As the trial proceeded, prosecutors presented forensic evidence contradicting Chambers' claims of accidental death. The force required to cause Jennifer's injuries indicated intentional violence, not an accident during consensual activity. Witnesses testified about Chambers' history of aggressive behavior and substance abuse. A videotape emerged showing Chambers at a party while out on bail, laughing and making crude jokes about the case. The footage horrified observers and damaged his defense significantly. Facing mounting evidence and public pressure, Chambers accepted a plea deal in 1988. He pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter admitting he intended to cause serious physical injury that resulted in Jennifer's death. The judge sentenced him to 5 to 15 years in prison. For Jennifer's family and supporters, the plea deal felt inadequate given the severity of the crime, but prosecutors worried that a jury might be swayed by the defense's victim-blaming strategy. Chambers served the full 15-year sentence, partly because he continued committing infractions while incarcerated. Upon his release in 2003, many hoped he would rebuild his life instead. In 2007, he was arrested again, this time for running a cocaine operation out of his apartment. He pleaded guilty to drug charges and received an additional 19-year sentence. As of today, Robert Chambers remains in prison, his release projected for 2024. The Preppy murder case left lasting impacts on New York's legal and social landscape. It highlighted how wealth and privilege could influence public perception and legal strategy. It sparked important conversations about victim blaming in court proceedings, particularly in cases involving young women. Jennifer Levin's death became a rallying point for those demanding that the justice system treat all victims with dignity, regardless of the defendant's social status. Case 9. Paul Cortez. Catherine Woods arrived in New York City with dreams that echoed through countless aspiring performers before her. She wanted to act, to dance, to make her mark in the most competitive entertainment market in the world. The young woman from Ohio took work as a dancer to support herself while auditioning for roles that might launch her career. She lived in a Manhattan apartment, navigating the complicated balance between artistic ambitions and financial reality that defines so many young people pursuing creative paths in New York. In November 2005, a friend discovered Catherine unresponsive in her apartment. She had suffered fatal injuries in what investigators quickly determined was a homicide. The scene suggested a violent confrontation, an attack that escalated with terrifying speed. Catherine's death shocked the performer community, where she had begun building connections. Friends described her as talented and kind, someone whose potential would now never be realized. Detectives began the painstaking work of reconstructing Catherine's final days. They interviewed friends, colleagues, and anyone who had recently been in contact with her. One name emerged with particular significance: Paul Cortez, Catherine's former boyfriend. The two had dated for several months before their relationship ended, and multiple witnesses described the breakup as difficult. Cortez had struggled to accept that the relationship was over, and his behavior in the weeks before Catherine's death raised red flags for investigators. Forensic technicians processing Catherine's apartment discovered critical evidence. Cortez's fingerprints were found in locations that he later claimed he hadn't visited recently. His initial statements to police about his whereabouts and his last contact with Catherine contained inconsistencies that deepened suspicion. When detectives pressed him on these contradictions, his explanation shifted, creating a pattern of dishonesty that prosecutors would later argue demonstrated consciousness of guilt. The investigation also uncovered Catherine's personal writings. Diary entries described her relationship with Cortez and her growing unease about his possessiveness. She had confided to friends that he had difficulty respecting her boundaries after the breakup. These accounts painted a picture of a man who couldn't let go, whose attachment to Catherine had crossed into something darker and more controlling. Phone records added another dimension to the case. Communications between Cortez and Catherine showed that he had continued reaching out to her, even after she asked him to stop text messages, and call logs documented his persistent attempts to reconnect, some escalating in tone when Catherine didn't respond, as he wanted for prosecutors. This established both his emotional state and his ongoing presence in Catherine's life, despite her efforts to create distance. Forensic evidence collected from the crime scene included traces that connected Cortez to Catherine's apartment at the time of the attack. DNA analysis and other scientific testing supported the theory that he had been present during the fatal confrontation. The physical evidence, combined with his contradictory statements and the testimony about his emotional instability, built a compelling case. Paul Cortez was arrested and charged with murder. The trial became one of New York's most closely watched proceedings, involving domestic violence and the dangers faced by women trying to end relationships with controlling partners. Prosecutors presented their evidence methodically, walking jurors through the forensic findings, the testimony about Cortez's possessive behavior, and the inconsistencies in his own statements. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that prosecutors were building assumptions on top of assumptions. They suggested that other explanations existed for Cortez's presence in Catherine's life and apartment. They attempted to cast doubt on the forensic evidence and the reliability of witnesses who described Cortez's behavior as threatening. But the prosecution's case held together, each piece of evidence reinforcing the others in a pattern that pointed unmistakably toward guilt. The jury convicted Paul Cortez of second-degree murder. Catherine's family, who had traveled from Ohio to attend the trial, expressed profound grief mixed with relief that her killer would face justice. The judge sentenced Cortez to 25 years to life in prison, ensuring he would spend decades behind bars for taking Catherine's life. The Catherine Woods case resonated far beyond the courtroom. It highlighted the risks faced by women trying to exit unhealthy relationships, the way possessiveness can escalate into violence, and the importance of taking warning signs seriously. Catherine's friends and family have worked to raise awareness about these issues, hoping that her death might prevent others by encouraging people to recognize dangerous patterns early. Paul Cortez remains incarcerated, his appeals unsuccessful. Catherine Woods never got to pursue the acting career she dreamed about. Her story serves as a tragic reminder that talent and promise offer no protection against violence, and that the most dangerous time for someone in an abusive relationship is often when they try to leave. From Manhattan's performing arts community, we move finally to the Bronx, where a discovery by sanitation workers would uncover one of New York's most disturbing domestic tragedies. Case 10, Bahsid McLean. The morning of February 2013 started routinely for sanitation workers in the Bronx, but their day took a horrific turn when they discovered bags near a residential building that contained human remains. The discovery triggered an immediate response from the NYPD, who secured the area and began processing what was clearly a major crime scene. The gruesome nature of the evidence suggested not just violence, but a calculated effort to conceal what had occurred. Investigators quickly turned to surveillance footage from cameras in the area. The video showed a young man disposing of bags in locations where sanitation workers would later find them. Detectives worked to identify the individual, tracing his movements backward through multiple camera angles. The footage led them to an apartment building where 23-year-old Bahsid McLean lived with his mother, Tanya Byrd. When detectives approached the apartment to question McLean, they noticed his evasive behavior and inconsistent answers about his mother's whereabouts. He claimed she had left days earlier, but neighbors reported hearing disturbances from the apartment recently. Something about McLean's demeanor and his conflicting statements raised immediate concerns. Investigators requested permission to search the apartment, and what they discovered confirmed their worst fears. The residents showed signs of a violent struggle and subsequent cleanup efforts. Forensic technicians found evidence that Tanya Byrd had died inside the home. The scene indicated that after her death, McLean had attempted to dispose of evidence by dismembering her remains, an act that spoke to both the brutality of the crime and a desperate attempt to avoid detection. The clinical precision of the investigation stood in stark contrast to the chaos suggested by the physical evidence. During interrogation, McLean provided multiple explanations for what happened. His stories shifted as detectives pressed him on inconsistencies. Each version contradicted the previous one, creating a pattern that investigators recognized as someone struggling to construct a believable narrative while being confronted with irrefutable evidence. The surveillance footage, the forensic findings from the apartment, and the medical examiner's analysis all pointed to the same conclusion. Prosecutors faced the question of McLean's mental state and his competency to stand trial. Defense attorneys argued that their client suffered from psychological issues that might explain his actions and affect his ability to participate in his own defense. The court ordered psychiatric evaluations, which became a critical component of the legal proceedings. Ultimately, mental health professionals determined that while McLean had some psychological concerns, he understood the charges against him and could assist in his defense. The trial exposed deeply troubled family dynamics. Witnesses testified about the relationship between McLean and his mother, describing tensions and conflicts that had escalated over time. Friends and family members painted a picture of a household marked by dysfunction, though no one anticipated the violence that would ultimately occur. The prosecution argued that regardless of past difficulties, McLean's actions after Tanya's death demonstrated awareness of wrongdoing and a deliberate effort to avoid consequences. Defense attorneys attempted to contextualize McLean's behavior within the framework of his mental health struggles and the difficult circumstances of his upbringing. They argued for consideration of factors that might have contributed to his psychological state. However, the evidence of what he did after Tanya died, particularly the methodical disposal efforts captured on surveillance cameras, suggested calculated behavior rather than actions taken while in an impaired mental state. In 2014, Bahsid McLean was convicted of second-degree murder and unlawful dissection of a human body. The verdict acknowledged both the crime itself and the disturbing actions he took afterward. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison, noting the particularly heinous nature of the case and the need to protect the community from someone capable of such violence against his own mother. The McLean case became one of New York's most disturbing domestic homicides, not just because of the crime itself, but because of the relationship between victim and perpetrator. The idea that a son could take his mother's life and then attempt to dispose of her remains in such a callous manner, challenged basic assumptions about family bonds and human decency. The rapid investigation by the NYPD, from the initial discovery through McLean's conviction, demonstrated professional police work in the face of a deeply troubling crime. Tanya Byrd's family struggled to process both her death and the fact that her own son was responsible. They described her as a woman who loved her children despite the challenges she faced, making her death at McLean's hands even more tragic. The case sparked discussions about mental health resources, family intervention, and the warning signs that might have been missed before the situation escalated to violence. Bahsid McLean remains incarcerated, his appeals unsuccessful. The surveillance footage that captured his disposal efforts became a cornerstone of the case, demonstrating how modern technology assists investigators in solving crimes even when perpetrators believe they've covered their tracks. For the Bronx community where this tragedy unfolded, the case serves as a somber reminder that violence can erupt within families, behind closed doors, in ways that neighbors and friends may never anticipate until it's too late. From random attacks to calculated revenge, from fantasy that nearly became crime to violence hidden in plain sight. These 9 cases remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself. Some killers were strangers, others were family. Some were convicted in days, others fought through the system for years. But every case left scars that New York will never forget. Which story shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, you're clearly a true crime fan. So smash that like button and subscribe because we've got more unbelievable cases coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next